Relationships, huh? They can be amazing.
Yeah.
But let's be real, they can also be a bit of a roller coaster ride.
Oh, absolutely.
Full of ups, downs, twists, and turns.
For sure.
And sometimes you might even find yourself feeling like things are a little, well, one-sided.
That's a great point. It's something so many of us experience at some point.
Exactly, and that's what we're diving deep into today. One-sided relationships.
I love it. Let's unpack that.
We've got this really insightful article called 15 Key Signs of a One-Sided Relationship to Watch For to guide our conversation today.
Oh, that sounds like a great resource.
And together, we'll explore what it really means to be in this kind of dynamic.
So important, because I think a lot of people might not even realize they're in one.
Right, and more importantly, how to spot those signs early on.
Exactly. Awareness is key.
So we can feel empowered to create those healthier, more balanced connections we all deserve.
Love that. Empowering ourselves and really taking charge of our relationship experiences.
Exactly. Because let's face it, we all deserve to feel loved, supported, and valued in our relationships.
Absolutely. Relationships should be a source of joy and connection, not a drain on our energy.
So true. So to kick things off, let's get back to the basics.
Sounds good.
What exactly defines a one-sided relationship? I remember a time when I was constantly the one initiating contact, planning dates, always making the effort, and honestly, it was exhausting.
Oh, I totally get it. That feeling of exhaustion is a classic sign that things are a little off balance.
Yeah, it really felt like I was the only one putting in the effort.
Right, and that feeling of constantly having to push and pull to keep things going is draining.
It is. So how can we tell if a relationship is truly one-sided? Like, what are we looking for here?
So you hit on a really important point, that feeling of exhaustion.
Yeah.
That's often a major indicator of a one-sided dynamic.
I can see that.
At its core, a one-sided relationship boils down to an imbalance of effort, emotional investment, and that all-important reciprocity.
So it's not just about doing equal amounts of chores or anything like that?
No, it goes much deeper than that.
Okay.
It's about that sense of mutual giving and receiving in the relationship.
So like a give and take kind of thing.
Exactly, like a two-way street where both people are actively participating and contributing.
In a one-sided relationship, it's more like a one-way street.
Yes, exactly, and that can be a really lonely place to be.
It is. So, okay, we've talked about that feeling of exhaustion. What are some other signs that someone might be in a one-sided relationship?
Well, the article mentions this feeling of being emotionally lonely even when you're physically with someone.
Yeah. That resonate. It's like you're in the same room, but miles apart emotionally.
Exactly, and that's such a powerful way to describe it, that sense of disconnect, even when you're together, it can be so isolating.
Yeah, so it's not just about being physically alone, it's about feeling emotionally alone, even when you're with someone.
Yes, precisely, and the article refers to this as ambiguous loss.
Ambiguous loss, that's a new one for me.
Yeah, it's this complex emotional experience where someone is physically present, but emotionally absent.
So they're there, but not really there.
Exactly. And it can leave you feeling so confused and alone.
It makes sense. Because you're not technically alone, but it still feels that way deep down.
Right, and this disconnection can actually stem from different communication styles or attachment patterns, like the pursuer-withdraw dynamic the article talks about.
Oh, that sounds familiar. The pursuer-withdraw.
Yeah, so basically the pursuer, who's often driven by anxiety, might be constantly seeking closeness and reassurance.
Okay.
While the withdrawer, who might be motivated by a need for space, tends to pull back.
And that creates a cycle where one person is always chasing and the other is always retreating.
Exactly, and it can lead to a real imbalance in the relationship.
I can see that. So if someone always feels like they're the one initiating contact, planning dates, reaching out, that could be a sign of this dynamic in play.
It's definitely something to pay attention to. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that every instance of this dynamic is a red flag. Relationships ebb and flow. There will be times when one person naturally takes the lead more than the other.
Right, that makes sense.
But if it becomes a consistent pattern, if you constantly feel like you're the one doing all the heavy lifting, it's worth exploring.
Okay, so we've got exhaustion, we've got feeling emotionally lonely, even when you're together. What about constantly apologizing, even when you haven't done anything wrong?
Oh, that's a big one too.
Yeah, I've definitely been there in past relationships.
It's so common, and it often ties back to feelings of insecurity and self-doubt. Like you're not quite good enough, or that you're somehow responsible for the problems in the relationship.
Yeah, it's like you're internalizing the blame even when it's not yours to carry.
Exactly, and that can be really damaging to your self-esteem over time.
So it's not just about feeling bad in the moment, it's about the long-term impact on how you see yourself.
Yes, and this constant apologizing can actually reinforce those negative beliefs, making you feel even less worthy or deserving of a balanced and loving relationship.
Okay, so we've got those three signs: exhaustion, emotional loneliness, and over-apologizing. Are there any others we should be aware of?
Well, the article also highlights making excuses for your partner's behavior as a sign of a one-sided dynamic.
Well, I've definitely done that before. Trying to justify their actions or downplay their hurtful behavior.
Yeah, and it's a natural human instinct to want to protect the people we care about.
Right.
But when we're constantly making excuses for their behavior, we're actually preventing ourselves from seeing the situation clearly.
So it's like we're shielding ourselves from the truth, even if it's painful.
Exactly. And this can keep us stuck in those unhealthy patterns for much longer than we need to be.
It's like we're delaying the inevitable, that moment when we finally have to face reality.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be honest with ourselves about what's really happening in the relationship.
I see that. So it's not about pointing fingers or blaming our partner. It's about taking a step back and acknowledging the truth of the situation.
Exactly. And from that place of honesty, we can start to make more empowered choices about how we want to move forward.
Okay, so we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff. The signs of a one-sided relationship, the impact it can have on our self-esteem. It's a lot to process. But what about the emotional toll? Like, what are the long-term effects of being in this kind of dynamic?
Well, it's not just about feeling drained or exhausted. It's about the impact on our overall emotional well-being.
So it can actually affect our mental health.
Absolutely. When our needs are consistently unmet in a relationship, it can lead to a whole host of negative emotions.
Like what kind of emotions?
We're talking about guilt, shame, resentment, even a diminished sense of self-worth, like you're not good enough or deserving of love and respect.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it's why recognizing these patterns early on is so crucial.
Yeah. The longer we stay in these unbalanced dynamics, the more damage they can do.
Exactly, and the article actually shared a pretty stark statistic. 70% of people in one-sided relationships feel like their partners prioritize themselves above the relationship.
Wow, that's a pretty high percentage.
It is, and it really highlights that lack of reciprocity, that sense of not being valued or prioritized that can be so painful.
So it's not just a feeling, it's a reality for many people in these types of relationships.
Yes, and when your needs are constantly being overlooked, it can be incredibly damaging to your self-esteem and your overall sense of well-being.
I'm starting to see how all of these pieces fit together. But the article doesn't just leave us with a list of problems, right?
No, it doesn't.
It also talks about setting boundaries, which I think is where things can start to shift.
Boundaries are absolutely essential for creating healthier relationships, but I know they can feel daunting, especially if you're already feeling vulnerable in a one-sided dynamic.
I can see that. It's like, how do you even begin to set boundaries when you're already feeling like you're not being heard or respected?
It's a challenge, but it's so worth it.
Okay, so let's talk about boundaries. Why are they so important? And how do they relate to creating a more balanced relationship?
Well, boundaries are really about respect, both for yourself and for the other person.
Respect. I like that. It's about honoring both people's needs and limits.
Exactly. And when we set boundaries, we're communicating our needs in a healthy way. We're saying, this is what's okay for me, and this is what's not okay.
So it's not about controlling the other person, it's about taking care of ourselves.
Exactly. And I love how the article puts it. Boundaries are about respect. They set limits on unwanted behaviors.
That's a great quote. So simple, but so powerful.
It is. And when you start setting boundaries, you might encounter resistance, especially if the other person is used to having things their way.
Yeah, I can imagine that. It's like shaking things up, disrupting the status quo.
Right. And the article even gives an example of someone setting a boundary and their partner trying to guilt them into backing down.
Oh, I've totally been it. It's like they try to make you feel bad for having needs.
Exactly. But it's so important to stand your ground.
Yeah, to not let those guilt trips derail our efforts to create a healthier relationship.
Remember, setting boundaries is not selfish.
No, it's not.
It's about honoring your own needs and creating a more balanced and respectful dynamic.
Okay, that makes sense. But even when we understand the importance of boundaries, it can still be so hard to actually set them.
It's true, it can be scary, especially if you're worried about rocking the boat or potentially losing the relationship.
Yeah, that fear of the unknown can be really paralyzing.
It can, but it's important to remember that you deserve to be in a relationship where your needs are met.
And where you feel safe to express those needs without fear of judgment or rejection.
Absolutely. And sometimes setting boundaries is the catalyst for creating that kind of relationship.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves, it's about opening up the possibility for something better.
Exactly. It's about creating space for growth and transformation, both individually and as a couple.
Okay, that's a really inspiring way to think about it, but there's something else that's been on my mind, something we haven't really touched on yet.
Oh, I'm curious. What's that?
Well, we've talked about the signs of a one-sided relationship, the emotional toll, the importance of setting boundaries, but what about the why?
The why.
Yeah, like, why do people stay in these unbalanced relationships in the first place? I know I've definitely been there, holding on to hope that things would magically change.
Hope is a powerful force, and it can be tempting to cling to, especially when there's a strong emotional connection or a shared history.
Right, like you've invested so much time and energy into the relationship that you don't want to give up on it.
Exactly. And sometimes that hope can keep us going even when things are really tough.
But how do you know when hope is healthy versus when it's keeping you stuck in a situation that's no longer serving you?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, because I think we all want to believe that our relationships can improve.
Huh?
But at what point do we need to face the reality that maybe this isn't the right relationship for us?
That's a tough one, and there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with being honest with ourselves about what we're truly longing for in a relationship and whether those needs are being met.
So it's about aligning our hopes with our reality.
Exactly. And sometimes that reality might be painful to face, but it's also the first step towards creating something better.
I'm hearing a theme here, that honesty and self-awareness are really key to navigating these complex relationship dynamics.
They are, because when we're honest with ourselves about our needs and our limits, we're better equipped to make choices that support our well-being.
So hope could be a beautiful thing, but it's important to make sure it's grounded in reality.
Absolutely. Blind hope can sometimes keep us tethered to situations that are no longer serving us.
Okay, so we've talked about hope. What are some other reasons people might stay in these unbalanced relationships?
Well, the article dives into a few key factors, including fear of loss, the allure of the familiar, and even low self-esteem.
Ooh, those are big ones, especially the fear of loss. It's like, what if I never find someone else?
Right, or what if being alone is worse than being in this relationship?
Exactly, and then there's that comfort of the familiar, even if it's not always healthy or fulfilling.
It's true. Sometimes the pain of staying feels less daunting than the unknown of leaving.
It's like a powerful insight. It's like we're choosing the devil we know over the devil we don't.
Exactly. And then there's the low self-esteem factor, that belief that you don't deserve better or that you're not worthy of a more balanced and loving relationship.
And that can be so hard to break free from.
It can, and it's why exploring these underlying beliefs and challenging them is so important.
So it's not just about changing our external circumstances, it's about doing that inner work as well.
Absolutely, because when we believe we deserve better, we're more likely to create it.
That's so empowering, but all of this talk about hope, fear, and self-esteem, it's a lot to take in, and I'm wondering, is there ever a point where a one-sided relationship can actually become more balanced?
That's a great question, and one that many people grapple with. The article does acknowledge that changing ingrained patterns takes work, especially in long-term relationships.
So it's not impossible, but it requires effort and commitment from both partners.
Exactly, and it also depends on the willingness of both people to address the underlying issues that have contributed to the imbalance in the first place.
So it's not just about surface level changes, it's about digging deeper and really understanding the root of the problem.
Right, and it's about creating a space where both partners can feel safe to express their needs and work collaboratively towards creating a healthier dynamic.
That makes sense, because if one person is still resistant to change, then the imbalance is likely to persist.
Exactly. Both people need to be on board and invested in the process of transformation.
This has been so eye-opening already. But before we dive into the possibility of change and those actionable steps we can take to create healthier dynamics, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so we've talked about those deep-seated reasons people stay in these unbalanced relationships, things like fear and low self-esteem. But what about the shared history?
Shared history.
Yeah, I'm thinking about those couples who've been together for years, maybe even decades.
Long-term relationships, that adds another layer of complexity for sure.
It does, because you've built a life together, you have memories, shared experiences. it's not so easy to just walk away.
I agree. It's much more intricate when you have that shared history, those intertwined lives.
Exactly. So can a relationship that's been one-sided for so long actually change?
That's the question so many people in those situations find themselves asking.
Right, because it can feel like, well, if it hasn't changed by now, will it ever?
It's understandable to feel that way, and honestly, there are no guarantees when it comes to relationships.
Okay, so no magic solutions or quick fixes.
No, but the article does offer a glimmer of hope.
Oh, good. I think we could all use a little bit of hope right now.
Me too. So, the key, according to the article, lies in open and honest communication.
Communication, it always seems to come back to that.
It does, because without it, we're just guessing at what the other person is thinking or feeling, and that can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and resentment.
True. So when we're talking about open and honest communication in this context, what does that actually look like?
It's about creating a space where both partners can express their needs and feelings without fear of judgment or blame.
So it's about feeling safe to be vulnerable with each other.
Exactly, and it's about really listening to understand, not just to respond.
That's a subtle but important distinction, really tuning in to what your partner is saying, not just waiting for your turn to talk.
Yes, because when we listen with the intention to understand, we're showing our partner that we care, that we value their perspective, and that we're willing to meet them where they are.
That creates a sense of connection and intimacy.
It does, and that's where real change can begin.
Okay, I love that emphasis on creating a safe space for open communication. But how do you actually do that, especially when communication patterns have been dysfunctional for so long?
It's a process, and it's not always easy, especially if you're dealing with years of hurt feelings and resentment.
Right, because it can feel like, how do you even begin to have a productive conversation when there's so much baggage weighing you down?
It's a challenge for sure, but it starts with small steps.
Small steps.
Yes, and the article suggests using I statements to express your needs.
I statements, like instead of saying, you never listen to me.
Exactly, which can feel accusatory and put your partner on the defensive.
Right, it's like you're attacking them.
Yes, and that's not going to lead to a productive conversation.
So instead of, you never listen to me, what would be a better way to phrase that using an I statement?
You could say something like, I feel unheard when I share my feelings about this.
Oh, I like that. It shifts the focus from blame to your own experience.
Exactly, and it invites your partner to respond with empathy rather than defensiveness.
It feels less confrontational and more inviting of dialogue.
Yes, and that's what we want. We want to open up the lines of communication, not shut them down.
Okay, that makes sense. So statements are a good starting point. What else can we do to foster healthier communication in a relationship that's been one-sided?
The article also emphasizes active listening techniques.
Active listening, that sounds interesting. What does that involve?
It's not just about hearing the words, it's about paying attention to the emotions behind them.
So like tuning into their body language, their tone of voice, those nonverbal cues.
Exactly, and it's about trying to understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
So it's about putting aside your own agenda for a moment and really trying to step into their shoes.
You got it. And it's not always easy, especially if you've been hurt or frustrated in the past.
I can imagine that. It can be hard to let go of those past hurts and really be present in the moment.
It's true, but active listening is such a powerful way to rebuild connection and foster understanding.
So it's not just about hearing what they're saying, it's about feeling what they're feeling.
Yes, and letting them know that you're there with them, that you're listening, and that you care.
That creates a sense of safety and trust, which is essential for having those deeper, more meaningful conversations.
Exactly, and those conversations are the foundation for creating lasting change in any relationship.
Okay, so we've talked about communication, I statements, active listening, all great tools for fostering a more balanced dynamic. But the article also cautions against trying to change your partner, which I think is so important to remember.
It is, because ultimately we can't control how other people choose to behave.
We can only control our own actions and reactions.
Right, so while we can express our needs, set boundaries, and invite them to participate in creating a more balanced dynamic, we can't force them to become someone they're not.
So it's about acceptance, but also about recognizing our own limits and non-negotiables.
Absolutely, and sometimes, despite our best efforts, we have to face the difficult reality that a relationship may not be salvageable.
That's a tough pill to swallow, especially when there's love and history involved.
It is, but I think recognizing that truth is also an act of self-love and empowerment.
It's about honoring ourselves and our needs, even if it means letting go of something that's no longer serving us.
Exactly, and it's not about assigning blame, but recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and the other person is to walk away.
So we've explored the signs of a one-sided relationship, the emotional toll it can take, and the possibility of change. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something the article touches on.
Sure, what's on your mind?
Well, the article mentions that statistic about 78% of people feeling frustrated by unfair workloads in relationships. It seems like this imbalance extends beyond emotional labor to practical tasks as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great observation. And it speaks to the broader issue of equity in relationships. It's not just about feelings, it's about the division of responsibilities, both big and small.
So it's about who's doing what and how that makes each person feel.
Exactly, because when one person consistently carries the weight, resentment and exhaustion are inevitable.
It's like that feeling of always being the one to initiate chores, remember appointments, or manage the household logistics. Over time, it can create a sense of being taken for granted and unappreciated.
It can, and it often leads to a dynamic where one person feels like the parent and the other feels like the child, which isn't exactly a recipe for a healthy and romantic partnership.
No, it's not. So how do you address that imbalance? Because it feels like those practical tasks can be even harder to talk about than emotional needs.
You're right, it can feel awkward or even petty to bring up who does the dishes more often.
It can. Like, is it really worth fighting about who takes out the trash?
Right, but remember, those seemingly small things accumulate over time and contribute to that overall feeling of imbalance in the relationship.
So it's not just about the dishes or the trash, it's about the bigger picture of fairness and equality.
Exactly, and open communication is key here, just like with emotional needs.
So instead of stewing in resentment or dropping passive-aggressive hints, we need to have those direct, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about who's doing what and how it makes us feel.
You got it, and it's about approaching those conversations with a spirit of collaboration and a willingness to compromise.
So it's not about keeping score or demanding perfect equality.
No, it's not about that.
Okay, because I think sometimes people get caught up in that, like, everything has to be exactly 50-50.
Right, but that's not realistic or sustainable. Relationships are dynamic and needs ebb and flow. What works one week might not work the next, and that's okay.
So it's about finding a balance that feels fair and sustainable for both partners.
Precisely, and that balance might look different for every couple. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about finding a perfect solution and then never revisiting it.
Exactly. It's about an ongoing dialogue and a willingness to adapt as needs change.
That's such a valuable reminder because life is constantly changing and our relationships need to be able to adapt along with it.
They do. And sometimes that adaptation might involve seeking outside support.
Outside support? Like what kind of support are we talking about here?
Well, couples therapy can be a really valuable resource for navigating these types of challenges.
Therapy? I think sometimes people are hesitant to seek therapy, like it's a sign of weakness or failure.
I understand that hesitation, but it's actually a sign of strength and a commitment to growth. It's about recognizing that you don't have to go through these challenges alone.
So it's about seeking professional guidance to help you navigate those difficult conversations and create a more fulfilling relationship.
Exactly, because sometimes an objective perspective can offer valuable insights and tools that you might not be able to see on your own.
It makes sense. It's like having a neutral third party to help you see things from a different angle.
Right, and they can also provide a safe and structured environment to work through those challenging emotions and develop healthier communication patterns.
This has been such a rich conversation. We've covered so much ground, from the subtle signs of one-sidedness to the importance of communication, boundaries, and even the possibility of seeking professional support.
It's been great unpacking all of this with you.
Me too. And I know our listeners are walking away with a deeper understanding of one-sided relationships and the tools to create healthier connections.
I hope so, because knowledge is power. And when we understand these dynamics, we can make more empowered choices in our relationships.
Before we wrap up, I want us to circle back to something we discussed earlier.
Sounds good. What's on your mind?
Well, we talked about that statistic from the article, the one that said 55% of people in one-sided relationships feel like they do all the work.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful statistic.
It is, and it really got me thinking about the weight we carry in these imbalanced dynamics and how it can impact our overall well-being.
It's a heavy burden to bear, both emotionally and practically, and it often leads to burnout, resentment, and a diminished sense of self.
Exactly. It's like you're constantly giving, without receiving that same level of care and reciprocity.
Right, and that can leave you feeling depleted and disconnected, not only from your partner, but from yourself as well.
It's like you lose yourself in the process of trying to keep the relationship afloat.
It can feel that way, and that's why it's so essential to recognize those feelings and honor them. It's not selfish to prioritize your own needs and well-being.
I love that reframing. It's not selfish. It's an act of self-preservation and self-love.
Exactly, because you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself first in order to show up fully in your relationships.
That's so true. But I think it can be hard to shift that mindset, especially if you've been conditioned to believe that your needs are less important or that you should always put others first.
I hear that. It's a process of unlearning those old patterns and beliefs and embracing a new way of relating to yourself and others.
So it's about rewiring our brains, so to speak, and recognizing that our needs are just as valid as anyone else's.
Exactly, and it starts with awareness, recognizing those signs of imbalance, those moments when you feel drained or resentful is the first step towards creating change.
Okay, so what can someone do if they realize they're in a one-sided relationship? I know we've talked about communication and boundaries, but it can still feel overwhelming to know where to begin.
It can, but remember, even small steps can make a big difference. Start by acknowledging your own needs and feelings. What are you longing for in this relationship? What are your non-negotiables?
It's about getting clear on what you want and deserve, which can be a powerful process in itself.
It is, because when you know what you want, you're better equipped to ask for it.
And if you don't ask, you're not likely to receive.
Exactly. So get clear on your needs and then communicate them to your partner. Remember those I statements we discussed. Use them to express your feelings and desires without blame or judgment.
It's about inviting your partner into a dialogue, not issuing an ultimatum.
Precisely. And be prepared for resistance. It's natural for someone to feel defensive when their patterns are challenged.
So don't be discouraged if they don't immediately jump on board with your new boundaries.
No, change takes time, and it often comes with some bumps along the way.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear, because I think sometimes we expect things to change overnight.
Right. But relationships are complex and transformation happens gradually. Just keep communicating your needs clearly and consistently and stand your ground with those boundaries.
So it's about being patient but persistent.
Exactly. And remember, you deserve to be in a relationship where your needs are met and your efforts are reciprocated.
And if those boundaries are repeatedly crossed,
Then it might be time to reassess the relationship.
as we discussed earlier, sometimes the most loving act is to walk away.
It's true. Sometimes letting go is the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for the other person.
This deep dive has been so insightful. We've covered so much ground, and I know our listeners are walking away with a deeper understanding of one-sided relationships and the tools to create healthier connections.
It's been great having this conversation with you.
Me too. And before we wrap up, I want to circle back to that powerful question the article poses.
Oh yeah, the one about taking action.
Exactly. Knowing what you know now, what small step can you take today to move toward a more balanced and fulfilling relationship, whether it's with a partner, a friend, a family member, or even with yourself? That step can be the start of something truly transformative.
It can, and even a small step can create a ripple effect, leading to bigger and more positive changes down the line.
So true. Thanks for joining us on this insightful journey, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then. I'm ready. What were you thinking about?
Okay, so we were talking about those reasons people stay in those unbalanced relationships, but what about shared history,
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Like those couples who've been together for years, maybe decades even. You've built a life together, you have memories, shared experiences.
Yeah, so much intertwining.
It's not so easy to just walk away from all that.
It's a lot more complicated than just, oh, this isn't working, I'm out.
Right, exactly. So can a relationship that's been one-sided for so long actually change? Because there's hope.
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is, because it can feel like, well, if it hasn't changed by now, will it ever?
Yeah, you start to wonder if it's even possible.
Right, and it's easy to get discouraged.
It is, but I don't want to say it's impossible.
Oh, good, because I think we all need a little bit of hope.
We do. So the article actually talks about this, and the key, they say, is open and honest communication.
Communication, it always comes back to that, doesn't it?
It really does, because without it, we're just left guessing,
Yeah, making assumptions, jumping to conclusions.
Exactly, and that can lead to so much resentment and misunderstanding.
It can. So when we're talking about open and honest communication in this context, what does that look like in practice?
Well, it's about creating a space where both partners feel safe to express their needs and feelings without fear of judgment.
Safe space, that's so important.
It is, because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to be open and honest.
You're going to hold back. You're going to shut down.
Exactly. So it's about creating that sense of trust and understanding where you can really be yourselves with each other.
And that's not always easy, especially if there's been a lot of hurt in the past.
It's not. It takes effort from both sides.
Right, so it's not just about one person changing, it's about both people making the effort to create that safe space.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to listen, really listen to what your partner is saying.
Not just hearing the words, but actually understanding the meaning behind them.
Yes, and being able to empathize with their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
That's tough, especially when you're feeling hurt or angry.
It is, but it's so important for creating that connection and understanding.
Okay, I love that emphasis on creating a safe space for open communication. But how do you actually do that? Especially when communication patterns have been dysfunctional for so long.
It's a process, and it's not always easy, but it starts with small steps.
Small steps. Okay, I like that. It feels less overwhelming.
Yeah, it does, and the article actually gives some really practical tips for how to improve communication.
Oh, let's hear them.
One of the things they suggest is using I statements to express your needs.
I statements, I've heard of those, but I'm not always sure how to use them effectively.
Yeah, they can be tricky, but the basic idea is that you're focusing on your own experience rather than blaming your partner.
So like instead of saying, you never listen to me.
Exactly, which can feel accusatory and put your partner on the defensive.
Right, it's like you're attacking them.
Yes, and that's not going to be conducive to a productive conversation.
So instead of, you never listen to me, what would be a better way to phrase that using an I statement?
You could say something like, I feel unheard when I share my feelings about this.
Well, that's good. It's less confrontational.
It is, and it focuses on your own experience, which is what you have control over.
Right, because you can't control how your partner listens or responds, but you can control how you express yourself.
Exactly, and I statements are a way to do that in a way that's less likely to trigger defensiveness.
Okay, that makes sense. So I statements are a good starting point. What else can we do to foster healthier communication in a relationship that's been one-sided?
The article also talks about active listening.
Active listening. That sounds interesting.
It is, and it's a skill that takes practice, but it can really transform your relationships.
So what does active listening actually involve?
It's not just about hearing the words, it's about paying attention to all of the nonverbal cues.
Like their body language, their tone of voice, their facial expression.
Exactly. It's about tuning into all of those subtle signals that are communicating so much more than just the words themselves.
So it's about reading between the lines, so to speak.
Yes, and it's about being present in the moment, putting aside your own thoughts and distractions, and really focusing on what your partner is trying to communicate.
Wow, that's a lot to juggle, especially if you're someone who tends to overthink or get easily distracted.
It is, but it's a skill that you can develop with practice, and it's so worth it.
Okay, so active listening is about being fully present and paying attention to all of the nuances of communication. What else is important?
It's also about reflecting back what you're hearing.
Reflecting back, you mean like summarizing what they said?
Exactly, to make sure you're understanding them correctly, and it also shows them that you're really listening.
Oh, I like that. It's like saying, hey, I'm paying attention and I want to make sure I'm getting this right.
Yes, and it gives them the opportunity to clarify if you've misunderstood something.
That's so important because misunderstandings can really derail a conversation.
They can, and active listening helps to minimize those misunderstandings and create a more open and collaborative dialogue.
Okay, so we've got communication, I statements, active listening, all great tools for fostering a more balanced dynamic. But the article also cautions against trying to change your partner, which I think is so important to remember.
It is, because we can't control other people, we can only control ourselves.
Right, and trying to change someone else is a recipe for frustration and resentment.
It is, because it's basically saying, you're not good enough as you are, you need to change in order for me to love and accept you.
And that's a really damaging message to send.
It is, so instead of trying to change your partner, focus on changing yourself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, focus on your own growth, your own healing, your own boundaries.
So it's about taking responsibility for our own happiness and well-being, rather than expecting our partner to make us happy.
Exactly, because ultimately we're each responsible for our own lives.
Okay, that makes sense. But it can still be hard to let go of that desire to change our partner, especially if we see their flaws as hurting the relationship.
It is, but it's important to remember that we can't force anyone to change. They have to want to change themselves.
So it's about creating the conditions for change, but ultimately it's up to them to take those steps.
Right, and if they're not willing to change, then we have to decide if we're okay with that or if we need to move on.
That's a tough decision, but sometimes it's the necessary one.
It is, because staying in a relationship where your needs aren't being met can be incredibly draining and ultimately prevent you from finding true happiness and fulfillment.
So it's about choosing ourselves, even if it's painful.
It is, and sometimes that's the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for the other person.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground,
Yeah.
from the subtle signs of one-sidedness to the importance of communication, boundaries, and even the possibility of seeking professional support. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something the article touches on.
I'm all ears. What is it?
Well, the article mentions the statistic about 78% of people feeling frustrated by unfair workloads in relationships. It seems like this imbalance extends beyond emotional labor to practical tasks as well.
That's a great point, and it speaks to the importance of equity in relationships. It's not just about feelings, it's about the division of responsibilities, both big and small.
So it's about who's doing the dishes, who's taking out the trash, who's remembering to pay the bills.
Exactly, all those everyday tasks. That can create a lot of resentment if they're not being shared fairly.
It's like that feeling of always being the one to pick up the slack, to remember everything, to make sure things get done.
But over time, that can lead to a lot of frustration and burnout.
It can, because you start to feel like you're the only one who cares, the only one who's putting in the effort.
And that can really erode the sense of partnership and equality in the relationship.
So how do you address that imbalance? Because it feels like those practical tasks can be even harder to talk about than emotional needs.
You're right. It can feel awkward to bring up who does the dishes more often.
It can, like, is it really worth fighting over something so trivial?
Well, it might seem trivial on the surface, but remember, those seemingly small things can add up over time and contribute to a bigger sense of imbalance in the relationship.
So it's not just about the dishes, it's about the principle of fairness and shared responsibility.
Exactly. And open communication is key here, just like with emotional needs.
So instead of stewing in resentment or dropping passive-aggressive hints, we need to have those direct, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about who's doing what and how it makes us feel.
You got it. And it's about approaching those conversations with a spirit of collaboration, not confrontation.
So it's not about blaming or accusing your partner. It's about working together to find a solution that feels fair to both of you.
Precisely. And it's about being willing to compromise.
Okay, because I think sometimes people get caught up in that idea of everything having to be perfectly equal.
Right. But relationships are dynamic, and needs ebb and flow. What works one week might not work the next.
So it's about finding a balance that works for both of you, even if it's not always perfectly symmetrical.
Exactly. And that balance might look different for every couple. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about finding a perfect solution and then never revisiting it.
Exactly. It's about ongoing dialogue and a willingness to adjust as needs change.
That's such a valuable reminder, because life is constantly throwing us curveballs, and our relationships need to be able to adapt along with it.
They do. And sometimes that adaptation might involve seeking outside support.
Outside support, like couples therapy.
Exactly, because sometimes an objective perspective can offer valuable insights and tools that you might not be able to see on your own.
That makes sense. It's like having a neutral third party to help you navigate those difficult conversations and create a more fulfilling relationship.
Right, and they can also provide a safe and structured environment to work through those challenging emotions and develop healthier communication patterns.
This has been such a rich conversation. We've covered so much ground, from the subtle signs of one-sidedness to the importance of communication, boundaries, and even the possibility of seeking professional support. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier. Okay, so earlier we touched on that stat from the article. The one about 55% of people in one-sided relationships feeling like they do all the work.
Oh yeah, that one really stuck with me too.
It made me think about how much we carry in these kinds of relationships and how heavy it can feel.
It's true, it's a burden, emotionally and practically.
Exactly, and it's like you're always giving, and not getting that same energy back.
You end up feeling depleted, drained.
Yeah, and it's not just with your partner, it's like you disconnect from yourself too.
It's like you lose sight of your own needs.
And that's where things get really tricky.
Because you need to recognize those feelings, you know? It's not selfish to think about what you need.
It's so easy to feel selfish though.
It is, but it's essential.
So how do we shift that thinking? You know, going from putting everyone else first to realizing our needs matter too.
It's a journey, for sure.
Yeah.
It's about unlearning those old patterns and embracing a new way of being in relationships.
Okay, so unlearning, embracing, where do we even start?
Start by noticing, just recognizing those times you feel drained, resentful.
Those are our cues.
Exactly, those are signals that something's off.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening and they realize, oh wow, I'm in a one-sided relationship. What next?
Well, we talked about communication, boundaries.
Right, but it can still feel overwhelming. Where do you even begin?
Start small.
Small steps.
Yeah, what are you longing for in this relationship? What are your absolute non-negotiables?
So getting clear on our needs.
Yes, what do you want? What do you deserve?
That's powerful. Just acknowledging that.
It is, and then communicate those needs to your partner.
Using those I statements.
Exactly, I feel this way when.
I need this.
Right, focus on your experience, no blame.
So it's an invitation, not an attack.
Exactly, and be prepared for pushback.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's natural, people get defensive when things change.
So don't give up right away.
No, stand your ground. Remember, boundaries are healthy.
But what if those boundaries keep getting crossed, even after you've tried communicating?
That's when you might need to step back and reassess.
That's tough. But sometimes it's the reality.
It is, and walking away can be the kindest thing, both for yourself and the other person.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like we've really unpacked this whole idea of one-sided relationships.
Me too, it's been great.
And our listeners, I think they're walking away with a lot more understanding
I hope so.
of the signs, the impact, and what they can do about it.
Exactly, it's about empowering ourselves to create those fulfilling connections we all deserve.
Before we go, I want to bring back that question from the article, the one that really makes you think.
Oh yeah, I love that one.
Knowing what you know now, what's one small step, just one, that you can take today to move towards a more balanced relationship? Whether it's with a partner, a friend, family, even yourself, it's a powerful question.
It is, and it can be the start of something amazing.
That's what it's all about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another insightful conversation.
Okay, see you then.